Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. To those of you that have logged in on December 6th, and to those of you that are listening to this recording, thanks for taking the time to learn and explore social finance a little bit more. My name is Stephanie Pennington, and I'm the Marketing and Engagement Manager at Tapestry Community Capital. And we're going to be talking a little bit about community bonds today. So I'll give you a brief rundown of what I'm hoping to cover in the next 30 to 40 minutes. So I'll introduce you to Tapestry, a little bit about our history and what we do. Then we'll get to the meat of it. What are community bonds? We'll look at what sorts of projects are really well suited to using community bonds. I'll give a little case study that I think is quite inspiring, and then I'll do a little breakdown on what the timeline and process looks like for raising community bonds, and then we'll have some time for Q&A if there are any questions. So a little background on Tapestry. We are a nonprofit organization, and we support other nonprofits, cooperatives, and charities to raise community investment for what we call iconic or impactful community projects. We're founded by an organization called the Trek Cooperative, which has 20 years of experience in raising community investment for community-owned projects. And they really got their start in raising financing for community-owned renewable energy projects. And with Tapestry, we sought to bring that model of community investment and open it up to a wider array of organizations who really need to unlock alternative sources of financing. And so since 2004, we've helped to raise and manage $61 million in impact investments from 3,900 community investors. So what are community bonds? Community bonds are not very well known, but actually not very difficult to understand at all. They're quite similar to a conventional bond, only that they have, in addition to a financial return, a social or environmental return. So even more simply put than that, a community bond is essentially a loan from your community members to your organization. So it could be as little as $1,000, or it could be, upwards of $1 million or more. And the organization is taking that as a loan from the community, and then they're going to pay interest to that lender, to that community member, and eventually, after a set period of time, repay that principal to them. And this financing will allow them to implement some large-scale project that's going to bring change to their organization and to their community. So community bonds are a tool that can only be used by nonprofits, cooperatives, and charities. And this is because of an exemption under the Ontario Securities Commission. So a for-profit organization, in order to issue securities to their community, would have to go through a lengthy and costly process of becoming registered on a stock exchange. But these rules don't exist for nonprofits, charities, and cooperatives. So it's a much less costly and simpler way of raising capital from people that believe in your mission. So the bonds are always issued in the name of your organization. So at Tapestry, we support organizations to issue the bonds, but they're not a Tapestry bond. They're issued in the name of the organization. And like I said, they're an interest-bearing loan. And community bonds are actually not a new concept. So interestingly, they're very similar to a church bond, and church bonds have been around for a really long time, since the beginning of the 1900s, certainly. And it's a pretty widely used tool. In the States, actually, there are thousands of church bonds, and it's so big that there are even mutual funds that exclusively invest in church bonds. So while the term community bond might seem quite new, it's actually, I think, within faith communities, quite a widely known and accepted tool. So I think there are a lot of benefits to community bonds beyond the fact that they provide financing to implement amazing projects. So one financial benefit is that it can actually be a lower cost of debt. And that's because community investors actually put place a value on a social or environmental return being given to them in addition to some financial return. Whereas a bank might not value, for example, that you're impacting so many lives or you're feeding so many people. So it can be a lower cost of debt. We've seen interest rates for community bonds range from as low as 3% to as high as like 7 or 8%, depending on the type of project they're being used for. And one interesting thing about bonds is they can really be structured to the project. And I'm going to give an example later, which is going to make this easier to understand. But essentially, you can raise the capital as you need it so that you're not paying unnecessary interest on capital that you're not using. And I think what's really special about community bonds is that allows organizations to align their financing with their beliefs and values. One amazing thing is that community bonds allow wealth to stay within your community. So rather than paying interest out to a bank, if you're going to get traditional financing, instead you can pay interest out to your community, to the people that really believe in the work that you're doing. And this allows you to build really, really strong connections in the community. People take a lot of pride in investing in community bonds, and they feel a sense of ownership in the change that they're creating through that project. So I think those are some really strong benefits. So there have been lots of successful examples, and I'm just going to share like a couple of sectors here. So we've seen bonds be used to create arts and recreation facilities, arts and culture spaces, community hubs, co-working facilities, and sustainable food, sustainable energy, and affordable housing. Some organizations you may have heard of would be Artscape, the YWCA, Solar Share, the Center for Social Innovation. When you start digging, there actually are quite a few examples. And what we've really seen at Tapestry is that this is it's a really growing area. So it's expected that the market for impact investing in Canada will actually triple to $30 billion by 2023. So that's a huge increase. More and more we're seeing individuals and foundations and even corporations wanting to align their investments with their values. So making local, place-based investments that are meaningful to them. And interestingly, all of the campaigns that we have been involved in, and some of them have been quite large, our largest being about $5 million, they've all been oversubscribed. So that means that there's actually too many investors wanting to invest, so much so that you actually have to return the funds. And the real, I think, the real challenge here that we've seen is that there aren't enough investment-ready projects. There just aren't enough organizations that have realized that this tool exists and that they can engage their supporters as investors. So we're going to go through a little community bond checklist because it's important to know that this isn't a tool for everyone. And at Tapestry, we always look at these top 5 check marks before we'd ever engage an organization to move forward in exploring this as a potential way of financing a project. So the first and most important is that the project really has to be iconic and meaningful to the community. So it wouldn't be Tapestry judging what is iconic or what is meaningful, because it doesn't matter if it's us, it has to be meaningful to your community. So what that means could really vary between communities. It certainly has to generate a social or environmental impact. So that could also be measured in different ways, but there needs to be a measurable social or environmental impact. So these tend to be quite large projects because we wouldn't recommend to raise less than $500,000 in community bonds. And we're trying to change that. We want this to be a tool that's accessible to groups that are looking to raise less. But right now there are just fixed costs that don't really make it financially feasible to raise less than that threshold. And that's just because there are fixed costs around the legal aspects of doing this, and the marketing and outreach required to connect with your community. That threshold might be a little different if you have a really, really close community that you know are going to engage, meaning that like the marketing and outreach could be a little less expensive. And because you are raising investment, you would have to have a sustainable way of paying back investors over time. So the project would have to have a revenue model and have a business plan, and that would need to be communicated to potential investors. And of course, you'd want to get as many members of the community engaged as possible. So hopefully, if this project is iconic and meaningful, there would be potential for widespread community engagement. So we've got two examples. So on the left, a roof repair would be an example that I would say wouldn't work for a community bond project. So yes, you might need to raise capital. Yes, it could be costly, but would not have a revenue model that would allow you to repay your investors, nor would it necessarily be iconic or meaningful. A commercial community kitchen could be an example. So a church has a large unused space in the basement. Maybe they already have a kitchen, and they're thinking of fitting that out to then be accessible to the community, to small-scale food enterprises that want to get going, but maybe don't have access to a commercial-grade kitchen. So that's a project that could help potentially newcomers or small businesses get started. So there's a social impact there. The kitchen could double potentially as a soup kitchen. That's another social impact. And it's quite, I think, meaningful to the community. And in addition to that, would have a revenue model that would allow the church to pay back their investors over time. So I'm going to share one example. Although there are many inspiring stories to tell, I chose this one, which is the Mount Community Center in Peterborough. So this project was started by a charitable organization, which was called the Peterborough Poverty Reduction Network. It was a group of about 200 volunteers, service agencies that were working to reduce poverty in Peterborough. And they decided that, we've been talking for years about creating impact in this city, but we've never really done anything. We've never really taken a concrete action to combat poverty. And so they decided that they wanted to do something, but they only had $20,000 in reserves at that time. And they had this somewhat crazy idea of buying a building. And so they came across this beautiful old historic building. It's 132,000 square feet, and it was the former home of the Sisters of St. Joseph's. It had actually been already sold. It had been flipped to a condo developer, and the developer was just sitting on the property. And they thought, what a shame to have this turned into a condo. We really want to see this historic building that's been so important to our community stay in community hands. And so they approached the developer, they put that $20,000 deposit down, and then they needed to go out and find $5 million to buy the building. And so first they approached the city of Peterborough, and with some strong support from their network of volunteers and the community really backing this project, they managed to get $1 million from the city. And then they went to the county, and they approached the county, and they were able to get a loan this time, so a very low interest loan for $1.7 million. But they still needed to come up with that extra $2 million. And so they started to think creatively about what they could do. And they realized that their strongest asset was really their community. So they didn't have a lot of money in the bank, but they had a really strong group of supporters. And so they decided to raise community bonds. And And they were really, really successful in doing it. So in about 6 months, they managed to raise $2 million from 67 community investors. And actually those investments, so it was a minimum entry of $5,000, they managed to have them RRSP eligible. And this $2 million allowed them to redevelop the space. So they have an affordable housing wing where they have over 80 deeply affordable housing units available primarily to people who are on ODSP. They have several anchor tenants who are community service agencies that are locally based in Peterborough. They have a commercial grade kitchen, just like the one that I was just describing, where they allow primarily newcomers to either take training in developing food enterprises or rent out this space to do commercial catering. And they also operate a soup kitchen. And then they have a co-working space that is available to nonprofit and purpose-driven organizations. And up in the top left corner, you'll see now a multi-purpose event space. So it's a really creative project that has many, many social and environmental, positive social and environmental impacts, but also a revenue model that's allowed them to repay their investors. So I hope that sort of illustrates the potential of community bonds in a concrete project. And I'll just walk quickly through what the process of raising a community bond might look like. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the next slide, but this just sort of is a breakdown of the timing. So we always start with a planning phase, which is about 6 weeks. Then we move into a structuring phase, which is 2 months usually. Then the phase of actually going out and raising the investment, the really exciting part, and that lasts generally 6 to 8 months. And then there's the management. So this is something that organizations often don't think about off the bat, but when you're engaging investors, you actually do need to continue to manage them professionally for the term of the bond. And that's something that we do here at Tapestry. We've got a purpose-built platform called Atticus that allows us to manage currently just under 4,000 community investors. So we take care of everything from their interest disbursements to their filing their tax forms, helping the organizations understand how much interest has been accrued over time, and doing the final payout when the bond comes to maturity. So this is what a bond campaign in a little bit more detail would look like. So we start with a planning phase. And that's really important for figuring out what a campaign might look like for a particular organization. So budgeting and figuring out what resources, time, staff, dollars they have that could be put into doing a campaign. Then we go into a feasibility. So that's where we would actually look at doing a financial model. So comparing the organization's revenue and seeing what sort of rate of return they could offer investors, what would be feasible for them. Doing a risk and sensitivity analysis to make sure that this that they can comfortably that they could comfortably offer debt. And then we take the findings from that feasibility and that financial assessment and present that to the community and consult the community to ask them, okay, is this an attractive investment opportunity? Is this something that you would believe in investing in? And we take their feedback because you don't want to go out to the public and offer a bond that doesn't really meet their needs. So for example, if it's a younger group of people, they might not be interested in investing in a very long-term bond. Something around 3 years might be of greater interest. Whereas an older population might not mind having their money locked in for a little bit longer if they're getting a bit of a higher interest rate. So that would be the time when we would assess that. Then we go into the structuring phase where we lay all the legal groundwork to be able to do this. So putting together an offering package, which includes the offering statements and the term sheets. So all of that would outline to your investors the use of funds, how they're going to be repaid over time. It would also be the time when we would appoint a trustee. and we'd establish a sales process of how the investors would be onboarded. And then we go to the fun part where you publicly launch your campaign. You start producing the bonds, doing the transactions, releasing the bonds. And there you go. You've raised the capital you need while engaging your community. So I'm going to end there, but happy to take any questions either now or by email or phone call.